300 people don't simply vanish. Not from a plantation under lock and key. Not on the morning of Christmas. And not without uttering a single sound. Yet on December 25, 1859, that is precisely what occurred at South Carolina's Belmont estate. At dawn, when the overseer arrived to unlock the quarters, he found the doors still barred from the outside, exactly as he had left them the night before. The chains that had bound the enslaved workers lay coiled on the ground like shed skin. The work tools stood arranged in perfect rows. Cooking fires still smoldered, but every single person was gone. No footprints led away through the frost. Not a single boat was missing from the river dock. Bloodhounds brought in from neighboring plantations circled the empty quarters and sat down, confused, as if the scent just ended. The plantation owner, Thomas Vance, offered a reward equal to $500,000 today. Newspapers across the South published descriptions. Slave catchers combed 3 states for months. They never found one person. Not a single body, not one witness, not a clue that made any sense. What they did discover in the following weeks would raise questions the authorities desperately tried to bury. Questions about what had truly been happening at Belmont Estate in the months leading up to that Christmas morning. If Mysteries History tried to forget intrigue you, subscribe to this channel. We dig into the stories meant to stay buried. And this one goes deeper than anyone anticipated. Before we continue with the tale of Belmont Estate and the 300 souls who vanished without a trace, let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our community of mystery seekers is watching. Now, to grasp what happened that Christmas, you must understand what Belmont Estate was and what it had become in the year before everything changed. Because the disappearance didn't occur in a vacuum. It was the culmination of months of careful planning, desperate hope, and something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Belmont Estate sprawled over 1,100 acres along the Combahee River, roughly 40 miles southwest of Charleston. It wasn't the largest plantation in the Low Country, but it was among the most profitable. Rice, that was the crop that built fortunes in South Carolina, and Thomas Vance had inherited one of the finest rice-growing operations in the state when his father died in 1855. The estate had been in the Vance family for 3 generations. Thomas's grandfather, William Vance, had bought the land in 1798 from a fleeing British loyalist family after the Revolution. He'd built the first rice fields using knowledge borrowed from enslaved Africans who understood the intricate irrigation systems the crop demanded. By the time Thomas inherited the property, Belmont was producing nearly $40,000 in rice annually, an enormous sum that placed the Vances among the wealthiest in the region. The main house was a white columned structure visible from the river, designed to impress visitors arriving by boat. It had 12 rooms, including a library Thomas's father had filled with books on agriculture, philosophy, and classical literature. The furniture was imported from Europe. The silverware bore the family crest. Everything about the house was meant to project permanence, prosperity, and respectability. Behind the main house stretched the rice fields, vast geometric plots separated by irrigation canals and dikes that controlled the river's flow. From a distance, the fields looked orderly, almost beautiful in their precision. But up close, they were brutal. Rice cultivation required workers to stand in water for hours, sometimes waist-deep, exposed to disease, snakes, and South Carolina's suffocating summer heat. Malaria was common. Accidents were frequent. The work destroyed bodies. The quarters where the enslaved population lived formed a separate compound about a quarter-mile from the main house, positioned so those in the big house couldn't hear the sounds of daily life there. The crying children, the evening songs, the arguments, the grief. 32 cabins stood arranged in 4 neat rows. Each cabin housed between 8 and 12 people. The structures were simple, wooden frames with gaps between the boards, dirt floors, a single fireplace for cooking and heat. In summer, they were ovens. In winter, they were barely adequate shelter. There was a communal cooking area where meals were prepared in large iron pots, a small infirmary, really just another cabin with a few shelves of basic medical supplies, and surrounding it all, a fence. Not a high fence, nor a particularly strong one, but a boundary nonetheless. a line that defined where people were permitted to exist. By 1859, Belmont Estate held 307 enslaved people. The oldest was a woman named Dinah, believed to be in her 80s, though no one knew for certain. Birth records weren't kept for the enslaved in the early years. The youngest were infants born into bondage, their futures already determined. Among them were skilled workers, carpenters, blacksmiths, seamstresses, cooks, midwives. There were field workers who knew the rhythms of rice cultivation better than any overseer. There were house servants who moved through the main house like ghosts, present but invisible, seeing everything and saying nothing. And there were the children, dozens of them, from infants to teenagers. They worked, too, once they were old enough. The youngest carried water to the fields. The older ones learned trades or joined the field gangs. Childhood, as such, barely existed. Thomas Vance was 31 years old when the disappearance occurred. He'd inherited the plantation at 27 after his father suffered a stroke and died within days. Thomas had been educated at the College of Charleston, where he'd studied literature and philosophy before returning home to learn the practical business of plantation management. By all contemporary accounts, he was unremarkable, not especially cruel by the standards of the time, but not kind either. He was a businessman who saw the plantation as a machine and its workers as components. He kept detailed productivity records. He calculated the cost of feeding and clothing the enslaved against their output. He made decisions based on profit margins. He rarely visited the quarters, leaving day-to-day management to his overseer, William Trent, a man who had worked at Belmont for 15 years. Trent was efficient, methodical, and utterly indifferent to the humanity of those he supervised. He enforced the rules, maintained discipline, and ensured work quotas were met. Nothing more, nothing less. For years, life at Belmont followed predictable patterns. The seasons dictated the work: planting in spring, tending the fields in summer, harvest in fall, maintenance in winter. Sundays offered a brief respite, a few hours to tend small garden plots, mend clothes, or simply rest. Christmas brought a day or two of reduced work, a tradition most plantation owners observed, partly from custom and partly because small concessions were believed to prevent larger rebellions. But in March of 1859, something changed. Thomas Vance traveled to Charleston for a meeting of the Agricultural Society, where plantation owners shared information on crops, markets, and labor management. He returned 3 days later with a guest, Dr. Silas Cratton. Dr. Cratton was not a medical doctor, though he used the title. He held a degree in natural philosophy from what he claimed was a university in Pennsylvania, though later investigations would reveal inconsistencies in his credentials. He was 43, tall and thin, with dark hair graying at the temples and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. He had spent years traveling through the Caribbean and South America, studying what he called labor efficiency systems. He'd observed sugar plantations in Cuba, coffee plantations in Brazil, and mining operations in Peru. He'd taken notes on how different populations responded to different management techniques. He developed theories about human behavior, motivation, and control. And he came to Belmont Estate with a proposal Thomas Vance found irresistible. Cratton claimed he could increase the plantation's productivity by 40% within a year, without purchasing additional workers or land. His method was scientific, based on careful observation and principles he developed through years of research. All he needed was access to the enslaved population and the freedom to implement his system. Vance, always looking to increase profits, agreed immediately. He offered Cratton room and board in the main house and a generous fee to be paid at year's end if the promised results materialized. Cratton arrived at Belmont with 3 large trunks of equipment. He spent his first week observing, walking the fields, watching people work, taking notes in a leather-bound journal he carried everywhere. He spoke to no one except Vance and Trent. He simply watched. Then he requested a workspace. Vance gave him use of an outbuilding previously used for storing equipment. It was about 30 feet long and 20 wide, with a wooden floor, solid walls, and a few small windows. Cratton had the windows covered with heavy cloth. He installed serious locks, the kind used on Charleston warehouses. He brought in furniture, a desk, chairs, shelves. He unpacked his equipment, brass instruments with dials and gauges, glass containers of various sizes, leather straps mounted on wooden frames, notebooks, writing implements, lamps that burned with unusual brightness. Workers who glimpsed inside when the doors opened briefly described seeing things they didn't understand, diagrams on the walls, charts with numbers and symbols, strange tools that looked like they belonged in a doctor's office or a workshop. Within 2 weeks of his arrival, Cratton began what he called assessments. The first group, 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, all field workers in their 20s and 30s, was brought to his building on a Monday morning in late March. Trent escorted them from the quarters and left them there. They emerged 6 hours later. They were quiet, not silent, but subdued in an unusual way. When asked what had happened inside, they gave vague answers. "He measured us," one man said. Asked questions, a woman added. Nothing more. Over the following weeks, every person at Belmont underwent an assessment. Cratton worked methodically, bringing in groups of 5 or 6 at a time. Sessions lasted anywhere from 4 to 8 hours. What happened during these assessments would later become a subject of intense speculation and horror. Based on survivor testimony and fragments of Cratton's notes eventually discovered, we can piece together some of what occurred. Cratton measured everything: height, weight, arm span, hand size, chest circumference. He measured how far people could reach, how much weight they could lift, how long they could stand without sitting. He timed how quickly they could complete simple tasks, picking up objects, moving across the room, responding to commands. He asked questions, hundreds of them, about their families, childhoods, fears, dreams, what made them angry, sad, obedient. He asked about relationships with other workers, overseers, the Vance family. He took notes on everything. Each person had a file, pages of observations in Cratton's precise handwriting. And then there were the tests. These were more disturbing. Cratton would present hypothetical scenarios and ask how they would respond. He would show objects and ask for uses. He would give pointless tasks, arranging blocks in patterns, repeating number sequences, standing in uncomfortable positions for extended periods, and observe their reactions. Some found the assessments merely tedious. Others found them deeply unsettling. There was something about Cratton's manner, the way he watched, the way he wrote in his notebook, the way he seemed to look not asterisk at asterisk them but asterisk through asterisk them, that created profound unease. But the assessments were only the beginning. Once Cratton completed his initial observations, he began implementing what he called his system. The work schedule was restructured. People were reassigned to different tasks based on criteria only Cratton understood. Some field workers were moved to maintenance, some house servants were sent to the fields. The changes seemed arbitrary, but Cratton insisted they were based on careful analysis of each person's capabilities and psychological profile. Rations were adjusted. Some received more food, particularly those Cratton identified as high-value workers. Others received less. The reductions were small at first, barely noticeable, but they created a new hierarchy. Work quotas were modified. Some tasks now had specific time limits. Failure to meet them resulted in what Cratton called corrective interventions. And then came the treatments. These began in May, about 2 months after Cratton's arrival. Workers showing signs of what he called reduced efficiency, illness, exhaustion, or simply moving too slowly, were taken to his building for correction. These sessions were different from the assessments. They lasted longer, sometimes an entire day, and the people who underwent them came back changed. The changes were subtle at first. A field worker named Marcus, always talkative and quick to laugh, returned quiet and focused. He worked faster than before, never pausing to rest, never speaking unless spoken to. His wife said he barely slept, he'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling as if he'd forgotten how to rest. A woman named Lily, recovering from a fever, returned moving mechanically, as if her body operated on instructions her mind wasn't fully processing. She would start a task and continue until someone physically stopped her, even if it was complete. A young man named Benjamin developed a constant hand tremor after his treatment, making fine work difficult, but he never complained, never asked for help. He simply worked through it, hands shaking, face expressionless. By summer, fear had begun to spread through the quarters. People whispered about Cratton's building. They called it the correction house, or simply his place, speaking in hushed tones. Parents warned children to work hard, to never give Trent or Cratton reason to notice them. But working hard wasn't always enough. Cratton's criteria for who needed treatment seemed to expand. At first, it was only the clearly struggling, the sick, injured, exhausted. But gradually, others were selected, those who asked too many questions, those forming close friendships, those singing certain songs or telling certain stories. It was as if Cratton was trying to identify and eliminate some specific quality he saw as problematic. And then people started dying. The first death occurred in early July. Henry was 32, a field worker who had been at Belmont his entire life. Strong, healthy, known for working long hours in brutal heat without complaint. He had a wife, Clara, and 3 children. In late June, Cratton selected Henry for treatment. The reason wasn't clear. Henry hadn't been sick or slow, but Trent brought him to the correction house on a Tuesday morning. He emerged 2 days later. Clara said he was different immediately. He wouldn't speak. He wouldn't eat. He'd stand in their cabin staring at the wall for hours. When she tried to touch him, he flinched away. In the fields, he worked with strange intensity, moving faster than seemed humanly possible, never stopping, never resting. Others tried to talk to him, but he didn't respond, as if he couldn't hear them, or had forgotten how to process language. After 4 days, he collapsed. Carried to the infirmary, he lay on a cot, eyes open but unseeing. He died that night without ever speaking again. The official cause was listed as fever, but everyone knew that wasn't right. Henry hadn't had a fever. He'd had something else, something done to him in Cratton's building. 3 more people died over the next 2 weeks. All had recently undergone treatment. All exhibited similar symptoms: withdrawal, mechanical behavior, inability to eat or sleep, followed by sudden collapse. Cratton showed no concern. When Vance questioned the deaths, Cratton explained that some subjects were incompatible with the optimization process. It was unfortunate, he said, but inevitable. The benefits to the overall system outweighed the occasional loss. Vance, focused on the improving productivity numbers, accepted this. But in the quarters, the deaths created a crisis. People were terrified. They didn't understand what was happening in the correction house, but they knew it was dangerous. They knew being selected for treatment might mean death, and they had no way to refuse. In August, a woman named Ruth tried to run. 24, a house servant in the main house kitchen, she had been selected for treatment and was scheduled to report the next morning. Instead, she ran. She left in the middle of the night, taking nothing, heading north through the woods. She made it 6 miles before dogs found her at dawn. The punishment was public and brutal. Vance, rarely involving himself in discipline, made an exception. Ruth was whipped before the assembled population, a reminder of what happened to those who tried to escape. But the whipping wasn't the end. Afterward, she was taken to Cratton's building for what he called behavioral correction. She was inside for 3 days. When she emerged, she could walk and work, but she never spoke again. Not a word, not a sound. Her eyes were open, but empty, as if something essential had been removed. People who knew Ruth said it was like looking at a shell. The person who had loved singing, told funny stories, dreamed of freedom, was gone. What returned was something else. The incident with Ruth marked a turning point. Before, there had been fear. Now there was terror. And beneath the terror, something else grew: rage. But rage alone wasn't enough. The people at Belmont had learned through generations that open rebellion was suicide. The system was designed to crush resistance: the laws, the weapons, the dogs, the neighboring plantations ready to send reinforcements. If they were going to act, they needed to be smart, careful. They needed to plan in a way Cratton, with all his observations and theories, would never detect. If you're as disturbed by this as we are, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you think was really happening in Cratton's building. Because what comes next reveals that while Cratton thought he controlled everything, he was missing the most important thing happening right under his nose. The truth is, while Cratton conducted his experiments, convinced he was breaking individual will and preventing collective action, the people of Belmont Estate were doing something he never anticipated. They were organizing. The organization began in the most unlikely place, among the children. At Belmont, as on most plantations, enslaved children occupied a strange position. They were too young to be seen as serious threats, too small for constant surveillance. They moved through spaces adults couldn't, carrying messages between fields and quarters, running errands to the main house, playing in areas overseers ignored. And they were watching everything. In the months after Cratton's arrival, the children began exhibiting strange behaviors adults noticed but overseers didn't. They would gather in specific locations at specific times, always briefly, behind the woodshed at dusk, near the old, unused well, in the shadows between two cabins. They would sing certain songs, always the same ones, with seemingly innocuous lyrics that carried embedded meanings. Songs about rivers and stars and journeys, songs their grandparents had taught them, passed down through generations, containing maps and instructions disguised as melodies. One song, recorded in a visitor's journal at a neighboring plantation, included the lines, "When the master sleeps and the river runs, we'll follow the drinking gourd to the promised sun." The drinking gourd was a known code for the Big Dipper, used by people escaping slavery to navigate north. But when the master sleeps and the river runs, those were specific, temporal markers, instructions for timing. The children were messengers, carrying information in ways that seemed innocent. A child bringing water to the fields might pause to sing a particular song within earshot of certain workers. A child playing near the main house might repeat an overheard phrase that was actually a coded message. And the adults were listening. The planning had begun in April, shortly after Cratton's assessment started. It began with a man named Samuel. Samuel was 41, a skilled carpenter who had been at Belmont for 23 years. His skills gave him unique freedom of movement. He repaired buildings, built furniture, maintained structures, meaning he could move between the main house, quarters, outbuildings, and fields without arousing suspicion. It also meant he had access to places others didn't. In early April, repairing a door at a storage building, Samuel noticed something. Cratton's building, the correction house, had a root cellar. He discovered it by accident, checking the foundation for water damage. Tapping the ground on one side, it sounded hollow. Further investigation revealed a wooden trapdoor partially hidden by overgrown grass. It was locked, but Samuel was skilled with locks. He returned that night alone and opened it. The root cellar was larger than expected, about 10 feet square with a dirt floor and stone walls. Clearly old, probably built when the structure stored food years earlier. But what caught Samuel's attention was something else. One wall had a gap at the bottom where the stones didn't quite meet the ground. Cool air flowed through. Samuel investigated further. The gap led to a tunnel. The tunnel was old, very old, built decades earlier as part of the plantation's original drainage system, designed to divert water from rice fields during heavy rains. The system had been replaced years ago, the old tunnels sealed and forgotten. But this one hadn't been completely sealed. It was still passable. Samuel explored as far as he dared that first night. The tunnel was about 4 feet high and 3 wide, shored up with rotting timber but mostly intact. It ran underground toward the river. He couldn't follow it all the way, not enough light, and he needed to return before his absence was noticed, but he'd seen enough. The tunnel was a way out. Over the next week, Samuel told 3 people, his wife Rachel, and 2 men he trusted absolutely, Daniel and Joseph, both field workers, strong and smart, both with families desperate to protect. They began to plan. The tunnel would need to be cleared. Parts had collapsed over the years, debris blocked sections. They would need to shore up weak points. They would need to determine where it led and if it was passable to the river. And they would need to do all this in secret, working in the one place on the plantation they might not be observed, underground, in Cratton's own building. It was audacious. Dangerous. But possible. Samuel had learned to pick the lock on Cratton's building. It was good, but not perfect. Samuel could open it in under a minute. They began working at night. Small groups, never more than 3 or 4 at a time, would slip into the building after dark, access the root cellar, and spend hours clearing the tunnel. They worked in complete darkness, unable to risk a candle that might be seen through wall gaps. They moved debris by hand, feeling their way, shoring up weak points with stolen timber. It was exhausting, terrifying work. The tunnel was cramped and airless. The constant fear of collapse was overwhelming, and there was always the risk Cratton would discover them. But they continued. By June, they had cleared nearly 100 yards. They discovered it ran about 200 yards total, emerging in a wooded area near the river, well away from main plantation buildings. The exit was partially concealed by undergrowth, sealed years ago with a rotted wooden cover. With some work, it could be opened. They had found their escape route. But now they faced a bigger challenge: how to move 300 people through a narrow tunnel in a single night without being discovered. This is where the planning became truly complex. They needed perfect timing. It had to be a night when security was relaxed, overseers distracted, when they would have maximum time before the disappearance was discovered. Christmas was the obvious choice, the one day each year plantation owners traditionally gave a brief respite. Most overseers took the day off. The main house would be focused on celebrations. Security would be at its lowest. But problems remained. The cabins were locked from the outside every night. Chains binding certain individuals, those considered flight risks, were secured with locks only Trent and Vance had keys for. They needed to solve these problems. And they needed to coordinate 300 people, men, women, children, elderly, sick, to move silently and quickly through a tunnel accommodating only a few at a time. The planning consumed the summer and fall. More people were brought into the conspiracy, but carefully, selectively, only those who could be trusted absolutely, who understood a single mistake or betrayal meant death for everyone. They developed a system of signals. Certain songs meant certain things. Certain phrases carried instructions. The children became primary messengers, moving between groups, carrying information in ways that seemed innocent. They stockpiled supplies, small amounts of food taken from rations and hidden in the tunnel, water containers, blankets, anything needed for the journey after they emerged. They made contact with the Underground Railroad. This was perhaps the most dangerous part. The network extended even into South Carolina, but it was secretive, fragmented, constantly under threat. Contact required finding someone trustworthy who could arrange boats on the river Christmas night. Samuel made contact through a free black ferryman on the Combahee River. The ferryman knew people who knew people. Messages passed through a chain of intermediaries, each knowing only what they needed to know. By December, the plan was in place. On Christmas Eve, while the main house celebrated and overseers drank and relaxed, the people of Belmont would begin moving through the tunnel. They would go in groups, timed carefully to avoid crowding. The strongest would go first to help others. Families would stay together. The elderly and children would be assisted. They would emerge near the river where boats would be waiting, boats arranged by the Underground Railroad. The boats would take them downriver to the coast, where they'd transfer to a ship bound for Philadelphia and freedom. It was an impossible plan. It required perfect timing, perfect coordination, perfect luck. But it was the only plan they had. And then, 2 weeks before Christmas, something happened that threatened to destroy everything. Dr. Silas Cratton discovered their plan. The discovery happened on December 10, 1859. Cratton had been working late in his building, reviewing notes and preparing reports for Thomas Vance. The productivity numbers were excellent, exactly as promised. The optimization system was working. Vance was pleased. But Cratton had noticed something odd in recent weeks, small things, inconsistencies. Certain workers who should have been exhausted showed unusual energy. People who should have been isolated displayed signs of coordination. Patterns in behavior didn't match his predictions. Cratton believed in patterns. His entire system was built on the idea that human behavior was predictable, controllable, measurable. When patterns didn't match expectations, he investigated. That night, organizing files, he heard a sound. Faint, barely audible. A scraping sound from below. Cratton froze. He listened. It came again, definitely from below. From the root cellar. He took a lamp and descended to the cellar. The trapdoor was closed, but fresh scratches surrounded the lock. Someone had been opening it. Cratton opened it and descended. He found the tunnel immediately, an evidence of recent use, fresh footprints in the dirt, disturbed debris, the smell of human sweat in the stale air. Someone had been using his building to access an underground passage. Cratton's mind worked quickly. He understood immediately an escape route, a secret passage right beneath his workspace. He should have alerted Vance immediately. He should have called Trent and the overseers. He should have had the tunnel sealed and the conspirators identified and punished. But Cratton didn't do any of that. He saw an opportunity. This was the ultimate test of his system. A population under extreme duress, facing a binary choice between action and submission, would reveal the ultimate limits of behavioral conditioning. If his months of treatments had successfully suppressed their ability to organize, the attempt would fail on its own. If not, he would learn where his system had weaknesses. Either way, the data would be invaluable. He decided to let the escape proceed, but he would control it. He would be in the tunnel observing. He would see how they behaved under pressure. He would document everything. To him, it was the culmination of his experiment. He spent the next 2 weeks preparing. He recruited 2 hired men from Charleston, muscle who asked no questions and did what they were paid for. He told them they were helping prevent an escape, paying well for silence. He studied the tunnel, mapping its length, identifying weak points. He positioned supplies, ropes, tools, weapons, at strategic locations. And he waited. He didn't tell Vance. He didn't tell Trent. This was his experiment, and he would control every variable. But Cratton made a critical error. He assumed the people planning the escape were operating on instinct and desperation. He assumed they were disorganized, their plan crude and easily disrupted. He was wrong. The people of Belmont had been planning for 8 months. They had anticipated problems. They had backup plans. And they had something Cratton, with all his theories, never understood: they had each other. On Christmas Eve, as the sun set over the Combahee River, final preparations began. In the quarters, people moved through evening routines as always, cooking meals, tending children, singing songs. To any observer, it was a normal evening. But beneath the surface, signals were passed. Final instructions given. People said goodbye to places they'd lived, graves of family they'd never see again, small pieces of life built in captivity. At the main house, Thomas Vance hosted a Christmas Eve dinner for neighboring plantation owners, 8 guests and their wives. The dining room was candlelit, the table laden with food, wine flowing freely. Vance was in excellent spirits. The year had been profitable. Cratton's system had worked. The future looked bright. In the overseer's house, William Trent sat with his wife, drinking whiskey, looking forward to a rare day off. He'd locked the quarters himself, as every night. Everything was secure. In Cratton's building, the doctor waited in the root cellar's darkness, his 2 hired men beside him. He had a lamp, unlit. He didn't want to alert anyone. He had a pistol. He had his notebook. He was ready to observe. And in the quarters, as the last light faded, Samuel picked the lock on his cabin door. The escape had begun. The first group entered the tunnel at 8 p.m. Samuel led them, 5 strong men, to clear obstacles and help others. They moved silently through darkness, feeling along walls, counting steps to track progress. Behind them, at timed intervals, came more groups. Families stayed together. The elderly were assisted. Children were carried. Everyone moved in complete silence. The tunnel was cramped, terrifying. The air thick and stale. The darkness absolute. But people kept moving, driven by freedom at the other end. By 9 p.m., nearly 100 people had entered. That's when Cratton made his move. He lit his lamp. Sudden light in the tunnel was blinding. People froze, confused, terrified. Cratton stepped forward, hired men flanking him, positioned where the passage narrowed. "Stop," he said. His voice echoed off stone walls. For a moment, no one moved. Those in front were trapped between him and those behind. Those behind couldn't see but sensed something wrong. Cratton raised his pistol. "You will return to the quarters. This escape is over." But then something happened Cratton hadn't anticipated. Someone started singing. A woman's voice, from darkness behind Cratton. One of the songs the children had sung for months, about the river, the drinking good, the promised son. Other voices joined. Then more. Within seconds, dozens were singing. The sound filled the tunnel, echoing, amplifying until overwhelming. Cratton's hired men looked nervous. One raised his weapon, but the singing continued, growing louder. And then people started moving forward. Not running, not attacking, walking steadily toward Cratton and his men. Cratton fired his pistol into the air. The sound was deafening in the confined space, but people kept coming, kept singing. One hired man panicked and ran, pushing past Cratton toward the root cellar. The other followed. Cratton found himself alone, facing a wall of people moving with inexorable determination. He turned and ran, but in panic, made a fatal mistake. He dropped his lamp. It shattered on stone. Oil spread and ignited, flames racing across the ground and up wooden supports. The fire spread quickly, old, dry timber caught easily. Within seconds, a tunnel section was engulfed. People screamed. Forward movement stopped as those in front tried retreating from flames. But too many pushed from behind, unaware. The tunnel filled with smoke. Heat became unbearable. Wooden supports cracked and splintered. Then a section collapsed. It happened about 30 feet from where Cratton had stood. Tons of earth and stone came down, blocking the passage completely. Those ahead of the collapse, including Samuel and other leaders, were cut off from those behind. In chaos and darkness, smoke filling the air, screams echoing, Samuel made a decision. "Keep moving," he shouted. "Forward! Get to the river!" The group ahead of the collapse, 17 people total, pushed through smoke and heat. They heard collapse continuing behind, felt ground shaking, but didn't stop. They reached the tunnel's end, emerged into cold night air. Boats were there, waiting as planned. They climbed in, pushed off, current carrying them downstream into darkness. Behind them in the tunnel, 283 people were trapped. What happened to those 283 in the hours after the collapse is one of America's most haunting mysteries. When investigators excavated the tunnel weeks later, after discovering the 17 survivors in Philadelphia, they found the collapse section. They cleared it, expecting hundreds of bodies, victims of cave-in and fire. But they found nothing. No bodies, no bones, no clothing, no personal effects. The tunnel beyond the collapse was empty. Investigators were baffled. They brought in engineers, miners with cave-in experience. They searched every inch from root cellar to river exit. Nothing. As if the people had simply vanished. Several theories were proposed. First, bodies consumed by fire. But this didn't make sense. The fire was intense but brief, burning out once supports were consumed. Fire doesn't completely destroy remains, there should have been bones. Second, bodies washed away by water. The tunnel was part of a drainage system, perhaps water flooded after collapse, carrying bodies away. But engineers found no evidence of flooding. Ground was dry, no water marks, no connection to active waterways. Third, survivors removed bodies before fleeing. This made no sense either. The 17 barely escaped themselves. They wouldn't have had time to move hundreds of bodies. And where would they take them? The mystery deepened examining Cratton's building. They found his notebooks, dozens, filled with observations, measurements, theories, revealing experiments, treatments, psychological techniques. But the final notebook, kept in weeks before Christmas, contained increasingly erratic entries. Early December, the subjects exhibit unexpected coordination patterns. My conditioning should have prevented collective action, yet I observe organization. Requires further investigation. A week later, I have discovered their escape route. Rather than prevent, I will allow it under controlled observation. Unprecedented opportunity to test my system's limits. Then December 24th, final entry, handwriting barely legible, words running together, they are not what I believed. The conditioning did not. They have done something I cannot. The tunnel is, they are singing and the sound I cannot, The entry ended mid-sentence. Cratton's body was never found. Nor his hired men's. The mystery consumed local authorities for months. Disappearance of 300 enslaved people was a massive financial loss for Thomas Vance, one he couldn't afford. He offered enormous rewards, hired private investigators, traveled neighboring states searching. He found nothing. The story spread through the South, creating panic among plantation owners. If 300 could disappear from a locked plantation without trace, what did that mean for system security? Newspapers published wild theories, elaborate Northern abolitionist conspiracy, people smuggled onto ships to Caribbean or South America, even supernatural explanations, though quickly dismissed. No theory explained the physical evidence, or lack of it. Then 3 weeks after disappearance, the 17 survivors were discovered in Philadelphia. This should have solved the mystery. Instead, it deepened it. The 17 were found hidden in the hold of the merchant vessel Meridian Star departed Charleston 2 weeks earlier. Emaciated, dehydrated, terrified, but alive. Federal marshals under the Fugitive Slave Act took them. Thomas Vance traveled to Philadelphia to reclaim his property, but the 17 refused to speak before Vance or authorities. They would only talk to Margaret Lindsay, a Quaker abolitionist providing aid to freedom seekers for years. Lindsay met them in jail, spent hours listening, taking notes. What they told her was documented in letters to fellow abolitionists, later published in anti-slavery newspapers, though authenticity fiercely disputed by Southern publications. According to these accounts, the escape was planned 8 months, exactly as suspected. Tunnel cleared in secret, timing calculated, boats arranged through Underground Railroad. Everything went to plan until Cratton appeared. Survivors described the confrontation, Cratton's lamp, pistol, demand to return. The singing starting spontaneously, people moving forward despite threat. The fire and collapse. But then accounts became fragmented, contradictory. A woman, recorded only as E, told Lindsay something not in official reports. She said when tunnel collapsed, she was near the front, close enough to get through before passage blocked, but could hear behind. Screaming at first, as expected. Then screaming stopped, and she heard something else, singing. Coming from deeper in tunnel, where others were trapped. Not screaming, not crying, singing the same coded songs the children had sung for months. It was like they knew, E said. Like they'd planned for this, too. Like the collapse wasn't the end. It was part of something else. Lindsay pressed for details. What did she mean? What could they have planned? E couldn't explain. She only knew what she heard, singing, growing louder, echoing through tunnel even as collapse continued. Another survivor, Peter, told a different story. He claimed he was near the back of the group that made it through. He looked back just before final collapse, and in flame light saw something that made no sense, people, he couldn't tell who in darkness, deliberately pulling down support beams. Not accidentally, not in panic. Deliberately, methodically bringing down tunnel behind them. They were sealing it, Peter said. On purpose. They didn't want anyone to follow. Lindsay asked the obvious, Why would they seal themselves in? Peter had no answer. He only knew what he saw. A third, Sarah, young woman, told yet another story. She said in days before Christmas, whispers in quarters about a second plan. She didn't know details, adults were careful around children. But she heard fragments, something about the deep way, something about where the masters can't follow. She remembered the phrase because repeated often in final days, if the first way fails, we take the deep way. Lindsay documented all accounts. She sent letters to abolitionist newspapers in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. She testified before anti-slavery societies, using the story to fuel opposition to slavery. But accounts were so contradictory, strange, many dismissed them as exaggerations or fabrications. Southern newspapers certainly did, claiming Lindsay invented it for her agenda. The 17 were eventually returned to slavery under Fugitive Slave Act. Transported back to South Carolina in chains, they never returned to Belmont. Vance, perhaps fearing they'd inspire others, sold them to different plantations across the state. They were separated, scattered, stories lost. Margaret Lindsay continued searching for answers, corresponding with abolitionists, seeking any trace of missing 283. She never found anything. In months and years following, scattered reports suggested missing people might have survived, found freedom. But each raised more questions. February 1860, rice merchant Thomas Garrett, traveling coastal swamps 15 miles south of Belmont, found a recent camp. Fire pit with warm ashes, signs many had been there, makeshift shelters, cleared sleeping areas, discarded tools. But empty. Garrett reported it. Search party organized, but by arrival, any trail vanished. Swamp vast, treacherous, tracking impossible. Authorities concluded camp used by runaways from various plantations didn't connect to Belmont. But timing suggestive, camp scale, large enough for dozens, perhaps hundreds, unusual. April 1860, ferryman Jacob Mills, operating Savannah River crossing between South Carolina and Georgia, reported transporting large group, estimated 40 black travelers, one night. They paid gold coins, unusual, enslaved didn't have gold. Group quiet, organized, purposeful. Crossed at night into Georgia, disappeared into woods. Sheriff investigated, found no trace. Mills couldn't give descriptions, dark, more interested in gold. Story dismissed as unrelated, Georgia far from Combahee. But gold interesting, where would escaped slaves get gold? June 1860, shopkeeper in Wilmington, North Carolina, reported selling supplies, food, blankets, medical supplies, large quantity, to woman with unplaceable accent. Paid cash, polite but distant. When asked where from, gave vague answers, left quickly. Shopkeeper remembered her speech like she'd forgotten how to form words, relearning language. Report dismissed, North Carolina father. But description matched some who underwent Cratton's treatments, emerged changed, struggling with language. Could she have been from Belmont? If so, how reached North Carolina? Other reports scattered across South next 2 years, black travelers seen on Virginia Road, community of free black in Tennessee appearing suddenly, rumors of secret settlement deep in Appalachian mountains. None confirmed, none definitively connected to Belmont. But together, they suggested possibility at least some missing survived, escaped, found ways to live free. But others? The 283 trapped in tunnel? If died in collapse, where bodies? If escaped another route, where gone? And what did survivors mean by deep way, and where the masters can't follow? March 1861, weeks before Civil War began, something reignited interest. Package arrived at Charleston Mercury newspaper. Small wooden box, carefully wrapped, no return address. Inside, a single chain, one found at Belmont Christmas morning, chains that had bound individuals, found unlocked, carefully arranged. Accompanying note, elegant script on good paper, we are not lost. We are free. And we remember. Note unsigned. Newspaper published brief article, describing chain, transcribing note, speculating sender and meaning. But nation consumed by approaching war. South Carolina seceded. Fort Sumter attacked within weeks. Belmont mystery faded from attention. Thomas Vance lost Plantation during war. Union Army occupied Low Country 1862, Belmont abandoned. Enslaved who remained, those not disappeared, Christmas, freed. Vance never recovered financially, died 1867, still offering reward, still searching. Dr. Silas Cratton never seen again after Christmas Eve 1859. Family in Pennsylvania, contacted, claimed no knowledge of South Carolina work, said he'd always been secretive. Investigators found much background fabricated, university no record, claimed papers non-existent. Cratton as much mystery as disappearance. Tunnel filled in 1870s when property sold. New owners wanted no reminders. Cratton's notebooks eventually donated Charleston Historical Society, stored largely unexamined until 1920s researcher discovered them. Notebooks revealed full extent of experiments, psychological techniques, treatments, theories. Disturbing documents, evidence of systematic dehumanization disguised as science. But they revealed something else. Cratton had been wrong. His system assumed humans reducible to predictable, controllable components, will breakable, behavior shapeable, resistance eliminable through conditioning and control. Disappearance of 300 proved him wrong. Despite months of treatments, fear, trauma, careful observations, people organized, planned, acted collectively. Maintained hope. Protected each other. Found way to resist. Cratton's final entry suggests he realized this last moments, they are not what I believed. The conditioning did not, he discovered too late humans aren't machines, cannot be completely broken, people, even most desperate circumstances, can find ways to maintain humanity, fight for freedom. Chain sent to Charleston Mercury 1861 never traced to sender, but message clear, we are not lost. We are free. And we remember. Whether missing all survived, found freedom, established communities living in peace, unanswered. But perhaps most important truth, they tried. Facing overwhelming oppression, system designed to crush hope, 300 came together, attempted impossible. Planned months. Worked secret. Risked everything. Christmas morning 1859, walked away from Belmont Estate, leaving only chains behind. That act of collective resistance, regardless outcome, stands testament to human spirit's refusal to be broken. Historical marker near Belmont site doesn't mention disappearance, Cratton's experiments, 300 who vanished. But story exists in archives, old newspapers, survivor testimonies, memories passed down. And in unanswered questions, what happened Tunnel Christmas Eve 1859? Where did missing go? How did they survive if they did? What meant by somewhere masters can't follow? These may never be fully answered, but remind us history full of mysteries, events challenging understanding, resisting simple explanations, forcing confrontation with limits of knowledge. Belmont story one such mystery. 300 people don't just disappear. But maybe, just maybe, they found way to vanish more powerful than anyone imagined. Maybe found freedom not just destination, but state of being, something bloodhounds couldn't track, slave catchers couldn't recapture, system couldn't destroy. Maybe that's what deep ways meant, not physical root, but transformation so profound made them invisible to those who only ever saw property. Maybe that's real mystery of Belmont Estate, not where people went, but how became free in way oppressors could never understand or undo. This story shows even darkest history moments, people found ways to resist, hope, fight for freedom. What do you think happened that Christmas night? Believe missing found freedom, or another explanation? Comment below, let's discuss. If enjoyed this deep dive into history's puzzling disappearances, subscribe, hit notification bell, never miss investigations into stories history tried forget. Share with mystery lovers, check other videos on screen for more making question past. See you next video. Chains from Belmont never found again after package arrived Charleston Mercury star. But somewhere South Carolina, in swamps and forests reclaiming plantation land, might still be Trace's Christmas night. 300 people don't just disappear. But maybe, just maybe, they found way to vanish more powerful than imagined. And maybe their story, how came together, planned, walked away from bondage, more important than knowing exactly where went. Because act of walking away, choosing freedom facing impossible odds, itself victory. That victory, that choice, that moment 300 said no more and walked into unknown together, that's real story of Belmont Estate. That story history tried forget, but we remember,